The wind was cold that morning. Dust rose from the small path that led to the old wooden house. Inside, a girl stood by the window, holding a worn piece of cloth in her hands. Her name was Elsie. She wasn't the kind of girl people turned to look at. No glowing skin, no bright curls, no charming laugh that filled the room. Just quiet eyes and a heart that never complained. Her family didn't see her kindness. They only saw what she wasn't. Not beautiful like her sisters, not clever with words, not the kind who would bring a wealthy man home. To them, she was a shadow, someone meant to serve tea, clean, and stay out of sight. But that day, something in the air felt different. Her mother's voice was hushed but sharp. Her father's boots stomped across the floor. Whispers filled the room, about money, about opportunity, about her. Elsie didn't know that morning would change her life. She pressed her hand to the window, watching her father speak to a stranger outside. The man stood tall, his hat pulled low. His clothes were clean, his boots polished. He looked like he belonged to another world, a world she would never imagine stepping into. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the gestures. A nod, a shake of hands, a purse exchanged. Her heart sank. Something was being decided for her. She had no say, no voice. Only the quiet pounding of her heart in her chest. When her mother called her name, it sounded almost sweet. Too sweet. "Elsie," she said, "come here, dear. We have something to tell you." The girl walked forward, her hands trembling. Her father's face was hard, but there was no cruelty, only calculation. "You're going to live with Mr. Harlan," he said. "He owns a ranch. He's made an offer, an offer." The word felt heavy, wrong. Elsie blinked. "An offer," she repeated. But her mother only smiled tightly, smoothing her apron. "It's for the best, dear. You'll be taken care of." Outside, the stranger waited by his horse, unaware that the quiet girl inside was being traded away like something ordinary. She looked once more at her home, the house that never really saw her, and stepped toward the man who would change everything. The cart wheels creaked as they rolled down the narrow dirt road. The sun was setting, washing the sky in red and gold, and Elsie sat in silence beside her father. He hadn't spoken a word since they left the house. The only sound was the horse's slow steps, and the wooden cart groaning under its own weight. She clutched the hem of her dress, the one her mother had pressed and brushed that morning. It wasn't new, just cleaner than usual. "You should look presentable," her mother had said, eyes not meeting hers. Presentable for a sale. The word echoed in her chest like a dull throb. She wasn't sure how to feel. Sad, angry. She wasn't allowed to feel much in her family. When her sisters cried, their mother comforted them. When they shouted, they were called spirited. But when Elsie spoke, she was told to lower her voice, to stay calm, to be grateful. Maybe this was her reward for being quiet. A one-way trip to somewhere she didn't choose. She glanced at her father. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the road. He wasn't cruel, not really, just tired. Life had beaten softness out of him years ago. There was work and there was hunger and there were bills that wouldn't stop. And now there was her. A daughter too plain to marry well, too soft to scold, too quiet to notice. He spoke finally, his voice rough. "The man's fair, Elsie. You'll have a roof, food, work. That's more than most can say." Elsie looked down. "You sold me," she whispered. He didn't answer. The silence said enough. They stopped at a crossroads where a large carriage waited. It gleamed dark against the fading light. A man stood beside it, tall and broad-shouldered. His hat cast a shadow over his face. Mr. Harlan, the rancher. He looked like someone used to giving orders but not shouting them. His clothes were simple but clean. His boots looked heavy. When his eyes met Elsie's, she expected coldness, maybe disgust. But instead there was something else, something she couldn't name. Not pity, not kindness either, just curiosity. Her father climbed down first and nodded. "This is her. She's quiet, works hard, you'll have no trouble." Mr. Harlan studied her, his expression unreadable. "She'll be treated fairly," he said at last, his tone even. "I don't buy trouble." Elsie's stomach turned at the word by asterisk. Her father gave a quick, forced laugh. "She's no trouble, sir, just quiet." Mr. Harlan nodded once, then motioned toward the carriage. There's room inside. It's a long ride to the ranch." Her father didn't look at her when she stepped toward the carriage. He kept his eyes on the ground, muttering something about weather and time. She wanted to ask him to stop her, to tell her this wasn't real, but deep down, she knew he wouldn't. She climbed inside, and the door closed behind her with a sound that felt final. The ride was long. The air inside the carriage smelled faintly of leather and dust. Mr. Harlan sat across from her, his hat resting on his knee. The silence was thick but not uncomfortable, just strange. She could feel his gaze on her sometimes, steady but not sharp. He didn't speak until the moon rose, a pale circle in the dark sky. "You've worked on a farm before?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, sir." "Know your way around animals?" "Yes." He nodded again, satisfied. "Good. My housekeeper will show you around when we arrive." That was all. No small talk, no questions about her family. She was grateful for that. Every mile that passed felt like a mile away from the people who had decided her worth. Hours later, the carriage rattled through a gate. Lanterns glowed along a wide path lined with fences. Beyond them, silhouettes of horses moved in the dark. The air was cooler, cleaner. The ranch spread wide under the stars, peaceful yet alive. For the first time that day, Elsie's chest loosened a little. She stepped down from the carriage, her boots sinking into the soft dirt. A woman came out of the main house, her hair tied in a gray bun, a shawl around her shoulders. "You must be the new girl," she said, her voice brisk but kind. "I'm Mrs. Keene. Come on then, let's get you settled." Elsie followed her into the house. The walls smelled faintly of wood and coffee. A fire burned in the hearth, crackling softly. It felt nothing like home, cleaner, quieter, more certain. Mrs. Keene showed her a small room near the back. "It's not much, but it's warm. You'll start in the kitchen tomorrow." Elsie nodded. "Thank you." Mrs. Keene looked her over once, then softened. "Don't let the master's silence scare you. He's not a cruel man, just a man who's lost too much." Elsie didn't ask what that meant. She simply nodded again, grateful for the blanket and the quiet. When she was alone, she sat on the edge of the bed, fingers tracing the quilt's faded pattern. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows, carrying the scent of hay and earth. She thought of her mother's last look, a mix of relief and guilt. She thought of her father's hands, rough and still as he counted the coins. And she thought of Mr. Harlan's eyes, steady and unreadable like the land he owned. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her. A servant, a stranger, a mistake, maybe nothing at all. But deep inside, a small, fragile thought whispered, what if, for once, someone saw her as more than what she wasn't? The firelight flickered, painting shadows on the walls. She lay back on the bed, the soft quilt pulling warmth into her tired limbs. Sleep didn't come easily, but for the first time in years, she wasn't surrounded by voices calling her plain. Only silence. And somewhere in that silence, something began to shift. Something small, almost invisible, like the first crack of dawn before light breaks. Outside, Mr. Harlan stood on the porch, hat in hand, watching the stars. He didn't know why he had agreed to take her in. Maybe he pitied her. Maybe he saw something familiar in her quiet eyes. He couldn't explain it, not even to himself. But as he looked at the dark sky stretching endlessly above his ranch, he had a feeling. Something had changed that night, though he couldn't yet say how. The first morning on the ranch came with a chill that seeped through the windows and bit at her fingers. Elsie woke before sunrise, the faint sound of roosters echoing in the distance. The smell of coffee drifted in from the kitchen, and footsteps creaked in the hallway. She sat up slowly, the blanket heavy around her shoulders. It took a moment to remember where she was, the ranch, the deal, the man who had bought her. She dressed quietly and stepped outside her room. The house was larger than she had realized the night before. Wooden floors, tall windows, the faint hum of early work beginning. Mrs. Keene was already up, stirring a pot on the stove. "You're up early," the older woman said without turning. Elsie nodded. "Couldn't sleep much." Mrs. Keene smiled faintly. "New place'll do that to you. There's bread on the table. Eat quick, the master starts early." Elsie sat at the corner of the kitchen table and took a small piece of bread. It was still warm. She ate quietly, the heat easing the tightness in her chest. Outside, she heard the soft neigh of horses, the distant call of a man giving orders. She didn't have to look to know it was him, Mr. Harlan. His voice carried calm authority, deep and steady. After breakfast, Mrs. Keene handed her a list. "You'll help in the kitchen for now, and later you can feed the chickens. If you finish early, lend a hand in the garden." Elsie nodded, grateful for something to do. Work she could manage. Work made sense. The hours passed quietly. The ranch was alive in a way she'd never seen before. Men moved in rhythm, saddling horses, carrying hay, mending fences. The air was full of the scent of earth and wood smoke. When she finally stepped outside with a basket of feed, she saw him across the yard. Mr. Harlan was checking a fence post, sleeves rolled up, sunlight cutting across his broad shoulders. He looked like someone carved out of the land itself, steady, weathered, strong. She froze for a second when he glanced her way. He nodded politely and she quickly lowered her eyes. "Morning," he said simply. "Morning, sir," she answered, voice small but clear. He studied her for a brief moment, then went back to his work. She continued toward the chicken coop, feeling her cheeks warm. It wasn't embarrassment. It was something quieter, the awareness of being seen, if only for a second. Days began to blend together. Work filled every hour. Elsie cooked, cleaned, carried water, helped Mrs. Keene with chores. No one asked her questions about her past, and that was a relief. She moved through the ranch like a whisper, unnoticed but useful. Yet she began to notice him, how he always rose before dawn, how he worked alongside his men instead of just commanding them. He didn't raise his voice, didn't boast, didn't smile much either, but he listened when others spoke. And somehow, that silence of his felt less like distance and more like peace. One afternoon, she was in the garden pulling weeds when a sharp voice startled her. "Don't pull that one," Mr. Harlan said, stepping beside her. "It's not a weed, that's sage." Elsie looked up quickly. "Oh, sorry, sir, I didn't know." He crouched beside her, his large hands brushing the soil. "Easy mistake. Sage looks like weed until it grows." He paused, looking at her briefly. "Most things do." She didn't know what to say, so she nodded. "I'll remember that." He stood up, dusted his hands, and gave a small nod before walking away. But the words lingered. Most things do. After that, their paths crossed more often. Sometimes he asked about the animals or how the kitchen stores were holding up. Sometimes he said nothing at all, only offered a quiet nod as they passed each other. And though they rarely spoke, something gentle began to settle between them, a stillness that felt almost like understanding. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west. The sky turned dark, thunder rumbling low across the valley. Everyone rushed to secure the animals. Elsie ran to the barn with a lantern, her hair plastered to her forehead from the rain. Lightning cracked across the sky, followed by a sharp cry from the stables. One of the horses had broken loose. She didn't think, she just ran. Mud splashed up her dress as she tried to calm the panicked animal. The horse reared, wild-eyed, rope slipping from her hands. Then a firm voice cut through the storm. "Hold steady." Mr. Harlan was beside her in an instant, grabbing the reins, steadying the horse's head. His arm brushed hers as they worked together, mud and rain everywhere. The horse finally calmed, snorting, trembling but still. Elsie's breath came fast. Mr. Harlan turned to her, water dripping from the brim of his hat. "You could have been hurt." "I couldn't just let it run," she said softly. He looked at her for a long moment, rain pounding around them. "You're braver than you look." Her lips parted, but no words came. Then he handed her the lantern. "Get inside. You've done enough for tonight." Later, as the storm raged outside, Elsie sat by the kitchen fire, staring at the flames. Her hands still trembled from the rush of it all. She thought about his voice, calm even in the storm, the way he'd looked at her afterward, not like a servant, not like someone bought, but like someone real. The next morning the world smelled of wet earth and fresh air. The ranch had survived. Fences stood, animals were safe. Mrs. Keene was humming as she cooked, and the sound of hammers and laughter filled the yard. Life continued as if nothing had happened, but something inside Elsie had shifted. When Mr. Harlan passed through the kitchen doorway, she looked up from her work. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave the faintest of nods. "Good work yesterday," he said simply. Her heart lifted just a little. "Thank you, sir." He left without another word, but she could still feel the weight of that small moment. For someone like her, the girl no one saw, the girl who had been traded away, a single acknowledgement felt like sunlight after too long in the dark. Outside, the sky stretched clear and bright over the endless fields. She didn't know what this new feeling was or where it might lead. But for the first time in her life, she wanted to find out. Days passed into weeks, and the rhythm of the ranch became the rhythm of her life. The mornings were early, the work never-ending, yet something inside Elsie began to change. She no longer felt like a shadow moving through someone else's world. The air on the ranch smelled of grass and sun-warmed wood, and with every sunrise, it seemed to wash away a little more of the fear she had carried from her old home. She learned the routines of the place by heart. The horses knew her footsteps now. They lifted their heads when she came near, no longer startled by her quiet presence. The workers, once indifferent, began to nod to her when she passed. She didn't talk much, but when she did, her words carried weight. And always, somewhere nearby, was Mr. Harlan, steady as the land itself. She saw him most mornings, walking the fields, checking fences, talking to the men who worked for him. He didn't shout or command. His words were few, his eyes thoughtful. The others respected him, not because they feared him, but because they trusted him. And Elsie, though she hardly dared admit it to herself, found comfort in that quiet strength. One morning, while she was hanging laundry behind the house, she saw him coming back from the far pasture. The sun was already high, his shirt damp with sweat, his hat tipped low. She thought he might walk past without noticing her, as he often did, but this time he stopped. "You've been here a month," he said. Elsie froze, clutching the clothespin in her hand. "Yes, sir." He looked at the line of clean shirts fluttering in the wind. "You've done good work." She didn't know what to say. No one had ever said that to her before. Not her parents, not her sisters. She only nodded, her throat tight. Mr. Harlan glanced toward the horizon. "Hard work don't scare you, does it?" "No, sir." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Didn't think so." He adjusted his hat and walked away, leaving her heart unsteady for reasons she couldn't name. That night, while sweeping the porch, Elsie looked out over the fields glowing faintly in the moonlight. She thought about the way he'd said it, not as a compliment, but as a truth he'd simply observed. It made her feel seen, not as something bought or pitied, but as someone who mattered. As summer deepened, the ranch grew busier. Calving season brought long nights and early mornings. Everyone worked harder, slept less. Elsie helped wherever she was needed, carrying buckets, nursing weak calves, even standing in the rain to keep a fire going through the night. She never complained. And every now and then, when exhaustion threatened to break her, she'd feel his gaze from across the yard. It wasn't pity or surprise, it was something quieter. Respect, maybe. One evening, a small crisis struck. A young ranch hand cut his leg badly on a piece of equipment. The others panicked, shouting for help, but Elsie ran to him without hesitation. She tore a strip from her apron, pressed it hard against the wound, and told him to keep still. Her voice was calm, steady. Mrs. Keene fetched water, and soon Mr. Harlan arrived, his expression sharp with concern. "What happened?" he demanded. "An accident," Elsie said, not looking up. "It's deep, but he'll be fine if we stop the bleeding." He crouched beside her, his hands helping hers. Their fingers brushed briefly as they worked. "You've done this before?" he asked. "My mother taught me," she murmured. "We didn't have doctors where I came from." He glanced at her, something like admiration flickering in his eyes. "You think quick." She didn't answer. The boy winced, and she focused on keeping the pressure steady. When it was done, when the bleeding slowed, Mr. Harlan stood and told the others to get the injured hand inside. Then he turned to her. "Good work." It was only 2 words, but they lingered long after he walked away. Later that night, when she finally sat by the dying fire, her hands still smelled faintly of blood and smoke. She looked at the flickering light and wondered when she had stopped feeling like a guest in this place. Maybe it was never about the house or the work. It was about being useful, about belonging in quiet ways that no one noticed until they did. The next morning she woke to the sound of laughter. It startled her. This was not a place that laughed often. When she stepped outside, she saw the ranch hands gathered around the barn, joking about the night before. Even Mr. Harlan was there, listening, a rare smile crossing his face. For a moment he looked younger. Their eyes met across the yard and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, an ease. He didn't look away this time. Instead, he gave a small nod, a silent greeting that made her chest tighten. As days rolled on, their moments became frequent, yet always quiet. Sometimes, when she brought coffee to the men in the field, he would take his cup from her hand with a soft "thank you." Other times, he'd pause near her garden and comment on how well the sage had grown. She began to notice small things about him. The way his eyes softened when he looked at the land. The way he always tipped his hat when speaking to women. Even the faint scar along his jaw that caught the light when he smiled. But what surprised her most was how easily silence settled between them. She didn't feel the need to fill it with words. And he, it seemed, understood that. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of gold, he found her near the barn, mending a torn saddle blanket. "You work more than most men I've hired," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "Work keeps me from thinking too much." He leaned against the post, arms crossed. "And what is it you're trying not to think about?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "Home, or what used to be home." He nodded, eyes distant. "I know that feeling." For a moment neither of them spoke. The air smelled of hay and dusk, soft and familiar. Then he pushed off the post and straightened. "You're doing fine here, Elsie. You've made this place quieter." She frowned slightly. "Quieter. In a good way," he said, a small smile touching his lips. "The kind of quiet that makes a man think straight." When he walked away, her hand stilled on the fabric. The evening wind brushed her hair, and somewhere deep inside, warmth spread like sunlight breaking through a cloudy sky. That night, long after the lanterns were out, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She didn't know what was happening between them, didn't dare name it, but she knew one thing. For the first time in her life, her silence didn't make her invisible. It made her seen. The air had grown colder with the change of season. Mornings now carried a pale mist that wrapped the fields, soft and silent. Elsie rose before dawn as usual, her breath visible in the dim light. The house was still, the kind of stillness that made every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind, seem louder. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. The sky was painted in faint gray and silver. Horses moved slowly in the distance, their figures ghostly in the fog. She liked these quiet hours before anyone else woke, when the ranch belonged to the earth alone. But this morning, something felt different. A restlessness stirred inside her chest, a heaviness she couldn't explain. By mid-morning, trouble found its way to the ranch. A messenger rode in fast from the nearby town, his horse sweating, his voice urgent. Elsie had just finished gathering eggs when she saw Mr. Harlan meet him at the gate. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the look that crossed his face. Tense, measured, the kind of look that said something serious had happened. Within minutes the men began shouting instructions. Ropes, horses, wagons. Mrs. Keene came running into the kitchen. "Flooded river," she said breathlessly. "The lower pasture's gone under. The cattle are trapped near the edge." Elsie's heart jumped. "Is anyone hurt?" "Not yet, but if the water rises more." The woman didn't finish. She grabbed her coat and hurried out. Elsie didn't think twice. She grabbed her boots and ran toward the sound of commotion. The air smelled of wet earth and rain. Down by the pasture, chaos reigned. Men struggled in the mud, ropes pulled tight as frightened animals fought against the rushing water. The river, swollen from days of rain, roared like something alive and angry. Mr. Harlan was in the thick of it, mud up to his knees, shouting directions over the noise. "Keep them moving. Don't let the herd split." He saw Elsie running toward him and shook his head sharply. "Get back to the house." "I can help," she called out, voice nearly lost in the wind. "It's too dangerous." But she didn't stop. She waded into the mud, grabbing a rope that was slipping from one man's hands. The force nearly pulled her down, but she held on, her feet digging into the muck. "If we let go, they'll drown," she shouted. For a moment he stared at her like he wanted to argue, but then he nodded. "Fine. Stay close." Together they worked side by side, pulling, shouting, guiding the panicked animals away from the water. Rain began to fall again, cold and heavy. The sky darkened. The current tugged at her skirt, threatening to sweep her off balance. Once she stumbled and his hand shot out, gripping her arm. His voice was low but steady, even through the roar. "Hold on. Don't you dare fall." Hours passed like that, mud, rain, shouting, the ache of muscles stretched to their limit. By the time the last of the cattle was safe, the river had swallowed half the field. Everyone stood drenched and shaking, too tired to speak. Mr. Harlan turned to her, breath visible in the cold air. "You shouldn't have been out here," he said, though his tone was softer than his words. She brushed mud from her face. "And let you do it alone." His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Stubborn woman." "Someone had to be," she replied quietly. Back at the house, Mrs. Keene fussed over both of them. "You'll catch your death," she scolded, shoving blankets into their arms. But Elsie hardly heard her. Her hands still trembled from the effort, her heart pounding not just from fear, but from something else. She had stood beside him when others hesitated. She had been part of something bigger than herself. That evening, after the workers had gone to rest, she found herself on the porch. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool. Stars flickered above like tiny fires. She heard the sound of boots on wood and turned to see him standing there, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to her without a word. They stood in silence for a while, the kind that didn't feel empty. Finally, he spoke. "You saved 2 calves today, maybe 3. I just did what anyone would have done." "No," he said, his voice low. "Not everyone would have." She looked down into her mug, the steam rising into the night air. "You'd have done the same." He smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I don't know many people who'd run into a flooded pasture for someone else's animals." "They're not just yours," she said softly. "They're part of this place." He turned toward her then, his gaze steady. "You think of it as yours too, don't you?" She hesitated. "I don't know, maybe I just want to belong somewhere." He looked out over the dark fields. "You do. You belong here more than you know." The words caught her off guard. She wanted to believe them, but a small part of her still carried doubt, the voice of her past, whispering that she was unwanted, forgettable, plain. But when she looked at him, she saw something in his eyes that silenced that voice. They didn't speak again for a long time. The night hummed with the soft sound of crickets and distant water. When he finally set his mug down, he said quietly, "You've got more courage than most men I've met. You ever think your family made a mistake letting you go?" Her throat tightened. "They didn't think twice about it." He studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then they were blind. The words hung between them, simple but heavy. She turned her face away, afraid he might see how much they meant to her. The stars shimmered above, and for a long while neither of them moved. Somewhere in the stillness of that night, the ranch no longer felt like a place she was surviving. It felt like something alive, something that had quietly wrapped her into its story. And standing beside him, mud-streaked, exhausted but alive, she felt for the first time that maybe she was more than what her family had decided she was. Inside, the fire crackled. The smell of wet earth drifted in through the open door. He turned to go, pausing just long enough to glance back. "Get some rest, Elsie," he said softly. "You've earned it." She watched him disappear into the dim light of the hallway, her heart still beating fast, not from the day's work, but from something she couldn't yet name. The first snow of the year came quietly, drifting over the hills and the barn roofs like sifted sugar. The ranch looked softer under the white, peaceful in a way that made time seem to slow. The cold carried through the walls, and each morning Elsie wrapped herself in layers before stepping outside. The world had changed again, and somehow, so had she. She no longer hesitated before walking into a room. The ranch hands greeted her with warmth now, and Mrs. Keene no longer treated her like a guest, but as someone who belonged. Even the horses seemed to know her voice, coming to her hand when she called. The work was the same, feeding, mending, sweeping, but everything about it felt different. It wasn't labor she was doing for survival anymore. It was care, for the land, for the people, for him. Mr. Harlan had been spending more time away those days, riding into town to trade supplies or check on distant fields. When he was gone, the house felt too quiet, like the air itself was waiting for him to return. She never said it aloud, but every creak of the porch at dusk made her heart lift for just a moment, hoping it was him. One afternoon, the sound she longed for finally came, the crunch of boots against frost. She turned from the stove, wiping her hands on her apron just as the door opened and he stepped in, brushing snow from his hat. His coat was dusted white, his cheeks flushed from the cold. For the first time she noticed the weariness in his eyes. "You've been gone a while," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "Longer than I meant to. Roads are worse this time of year." She poured him coffee without asking. He took the cup, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment. "Feels good to be home," he said. Home. The word caught her breath. She looked at him, wondering if he knew what that meant to her. For so long, home had been a word that hurt to hear. But here in this kitchen with the smell of coffee and wood smoke, it felt different. He sat by the fire, quiet for a long while. "I ran into someone in town," he said finally. "A man who knows your father." Elsie froze, the warmth of the room suddenly distant. "My father," he nodded slowly. "He's been asking questions, heard you're still here." She swallowed hard. "Why?" Mr. Harlan's eyes were steady, but there was a shadow in them. "Money. He's fallen on hard times. Said he might come for you, said you were his unfinished business." Her hands trembled. "He sold me once. What more does he want?" "Desperation makes men foolish," he said quietly. "But you don't belong to him anymore." For a moment neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, and outside the snow fell heavier. Then she whispered, "If he comes here, I'll face him. I'm not that same girl." Mr. Harlan stood, his voice firm. "You won't have to face him alone." The next few days passed in uneasy silence. She kept to her chores, but her thoughts were restless. Each time she glanced toward the gate, she half expected to see her father's figure against the snow. When the knock finally came, it was late afternoon, the sky already fading to gray. She opened the door before anyone else could. Her father stood there, thinner than she remembered, his face worn and bitter. The smell of whiskey clung to him. "Elsie," he said, forcing a smile, "you look well." She didn't answer. "Your husband here?" he asked, peering past her into the house. "He's not my husband," she said flatly. He smirked. "Still pretending you're better than the rest of us." His eyes hardened. "You belong to your family, girl. We made you. You owe us." Before she could speak, Mr. Harlan appeared behind her. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "She doesn't owe you a thing." Her father sneered. "And who are you to say that? You think money makes her yours." "I didn't buy her," he said. "I gave her a home when you threw her away." The two men stood facing each other, tension sharp in the air. Elsie could feel her pulse in her throat. She wanted to hide, but something inside her refused. She stepped forward, her voice shaking but strong. "I'm not a thing to be owned," she said. "Not by you. Not by anyone." Her father's expression faltered, as if the sound of her defiance startled him. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence stretched, heavy and final. Mr. Harlan moved past her and opened the door wider. "Leave," he said simply, "and don't come back." Her father's face twisted in anger, but there was fear behind it too. He muttered something under his breath and turned, disappearing into the snow. The door shut with a quiet thud. For a long time neither of them spoke. Elsie stared at the wood grain of the floor, her body trembling. Then she felt his hand, gentle on her shoulder. "You did that," he said softly. "You stood up." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. "I didn't feel brave." "You were," he said. "Bravery's not about feeling strong. It's about standing when you've been told to kneel." That night, she sat by the fire long after everyone else had gone to bed. The snow outside had stopped, leaving the world silent and still. Mr. Harlan joined her quietly, setting 2 mugs on the table. Neither of them spoke for a while. When he finally broke the silence, his voice was lower, almost hesitant. "You ever think about leaving, about finding a life somewhere else?" She looked into the flames. "I used to, but not anymore." He studied her face, the flicker of light dancing in her eyes. "Why not?" "Because I've already found it," she said. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out, his rough hand brushing hers. The warmth of his touch was enough to melt the last bit of cold left in her chest. For a moment the world outside disappeared. No past, no shame, no labels. Just 2 people who had seen each other's truth and found peace in it. The firelight cast a soft glow around them, the quiet between them no longer empty but full, of things that didn't need words. The storm had passed, and in its place was stillness. A stillness that held everything they had fought for, everything they had become. And when he looked at her then, really looked, his gaze steady and certain, she knew without him saying it. She was no longer the girl who had been sold for being too plain. She was the woman he had chosen, the only face he wanted forever.